During the Armenian Genocide, hundreds of thousands of Armenians died. Now, we've mentioned the progress of the genocide several times in our regular episodes, but what we haven't talked about is the region of Armenia itself and the cultural and political background that led to the slaughter. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about the background to the Armenian Genocide. The First Republic of Armenia was formed in 1918 in the later stages of the First World War. But the historic homeland of the Armenian people had been fought over and disputed for centuries. From the 16th to 18th century, this was between the Ottomans and the Persians, and Yerevan, the capital of today's Armenia, changed hands no less than 14 times. Eventually, Greater Armenia, which was mostly Eastern Armenia, was annexed by the Persians, while Western Armenia went to the Ottoman Empire. By the 19th century, though, a new player had joined the game, the Russian Empire. Although Russia had fought Persia several times before, two Russo-Persian wars in the first few decades of the 1800s changed the situation, with Russia gaining new territory. By the 1830s, Persia had ceded most of its territory in the Caucasus and eastern Armenia to Russia. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, who were Christians, were living under the millet system, under which faith-based communities, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, had a large degree of autonomy within the empire. The Armenians were primarily in 6 provinces in eastern Anatolia, where they had their own communities and churches. A period of revolutionary awakening led to an Armenian national constitution, ratified in 1863, which provided for an Armenian General Assembly, which was granted certain powers concerning Armenian religious and cultural life within the empire. Political parties and organized resistance groups formed: Armenakan, Henchak, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. Now, the next few decades had some real flashpoints in the deterioration of relations between the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian people. For one thing, the Muslim Empire was growing smaller and weaker and was losing wars to Christian European powers and losing its territory in the Balkans to predominantly Christian emerging nations and nationalism. This provoked anti-Christian sentiment in general, but the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878 made a lot of that sentiment specifically anti-Armenian, since Armenian corps were fighting against the Turks on the Russian side in the Caucasus. In the mid-1890s, Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, in an attempt to reassert Islam as the state ideology of his empire and strengthen its territorial integrity, called for the massacre of Armenian citizens, although the killing did end up being more anti-Christian at times, and tens of thousands of Assyrians were killed as well. The number of Armenians killed during those years, of all ages and sexes, has been variously estimated between 70,000 and 300,000. In 1909, the Young Turks came to power and did something similar. In Adana Vilayet province, pogroms against Armenians resulted in 20 to 30,000 deaths. But a few years later, an Armenian reform package was written. Now, this was the brainchild of several European powers and would create 2 big provinces from the 6 vilayets of the empire where the Armenians mostly lived, that would be under control of 2 European inspectors general, and they would oversee all Armenian-related issues. This was even signed by the Ottoman Empire in February 1914, but it went out the window later that year when the Ottoman Empire joined the war. So, the war years. The empire tried to convince Armenian leaders to provoke a rebellion of Russian Armenians against the Tsar to facilitate Ottoman conquest of Transcaucasia, right? But the Tsar promised autonomy for Russian Armenia and the 6 Armenian vilayets in the Ottoman Empire in return for loyalty and support. And he got a lot of it. I mean, Armenians were religiously and often culturally closer to Russians than Turks anyhow. But nearly 200,000 Armenians in total ended up fighting for Russia as volunteers. So the Russian Armenian Volunteer Corps, about 4 battalions strong, was formed, a military fighting unit within the Russian army comprised mostly of Russian Armenians, but also Ottoman Armenians. Andronik Ozanian, commander of the 1st Armenian Battalion, led the Caucasus campaign. Now, he was a key figure in the Armenian National Liberation Movement and an active member in the armed struggle against the Ottomans. and a national Armenian hero of almost legendary status. Apparently, the Kurds called him a ghost and said that bullets fell to the ground when he took off his jacket. Armenian soldiers took part in that first Russian offensive of the Caucasus campaign, the Bergman Offensive, but more importantly, in the Battle of Sarikamish from late December 1914 to mid-January 1915. This battle was a spectacular disaster for the Ottoman Empire, and specifically Minister of War Enver Pasha, who screwed it up on a colossal scale. The Ottoman Third Army was nearly totally destroyed, partly by the enemy and partly by incompetence, with thousands of Turks freezing to death in summer uniforms in minus 30-degree temperatures, with some estimates claiming that as little as 10% of the Turks made it back to their base. Enver Pasha was very quick to lay blame for the defeat on the Armenians, whom he called traitors, including those that lived in Russia, not just those that defected to the Russians, and things began to explode. On April 24th, which is known as the Armenian Day of Mourning, Armenian intellectuals, politicians, and other well-known figures in Constantinople were arrested and sentenced to death. This was the official beginning of the Armenian Genocide. Soon, the order would go out to deport and exterminate Armenian civilians in villages all across Ottoman Armenia. As you may know, this was depressingly successful, despite wholesale condemnation from most of the rest of the world. There were exceptions, though. At Musa Dag, a mountain near the eastern Mediterranean coast, local citizens held out against repeated assaults for 53 days until they were rescued and evacuated by Allied warships to Egypt. 4,200 of them were saved. This inspired the internationally famous novel, The 40 Days of Musa Dag. The Armenians also held out at the siege of Van until Russian relief could arrive. Van was an important cultural, social, and economic center for the Armenians, and Aram Manukyan was the community leader. He led the rebellion against the Ottomans and was joined in the siege by Andronik. The Ottomans retired to the west, and eventually the Republic of Van was established with Aram Manukyan as governor. Andronik continued his series of victories that summer with the Battle of Bitlis. This was the last Ottoman stronghold in the region and was a major Russian victory. Also at this time, the French-Armenian Agreement was signed, which called for a legion that would help with the liberation of Cilicia from the Ottoman Empire, and for this legion to one day become the Army of Armenia. However, the Russian Revolution several months later drastically changed the situation. This caused a breakdown of the Russian Caucasus campaign, and eventually the Russians and Ottomans signed the Armistice of Erzincan, which ended hostilities between them. In May 1918, Armenians proclaimed the First Republic of Armenia with Yerevan as capital. As the republic was getting going, Ottoman forces reached Alexandropol and threatened Yerevan, but after the Bolshevik Revolution, Armenia found itself without Russian support. They managed to hold off the Ottoman forces, however, though they lost a lot of territory, and that's the way things stood at the end of the war. Post-war, the republic soon fell to the Soviets and became part of the Soviet Union, and many of Armenia's leaders were forced into exile. Territorial disputes between Turkey and the Soviet Union over Armenian land were concluded without the voice of the Armenians. So there you have it. A very brief overview of the Armenians, their situation with Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and the events that led up to the Armenian Genocide. I think it's very important to note that when people write about the genocide, one often gets the impression that the Armenians were just unfortunate sheep just meekly submitting to their fate, but the reality is anything but that. They were, and are, a strong people with deep religious and cultural traditions who certainly weren't afraid to try to assert their independence. And the Armenian Genocide remains one of the great catastrophes of the 20th century.
Auschwitz, the largest and most complex of the Nazi camps.
405,000 prisoners.
5 years of operation.
A
A registration number was tattooed on their left forearm to remind them of this time, forever. Ever since the discovery of the horrors committed at Auschwitz had been revealed, it has generally been accepted that the Holocaust was a time of tragedy and desperation.
However, there are a handful of individuals that disagree. They argue these events never even occurred. The roots of Holocaust denial can be found in the language of the Nazi policy itself, which sought to camouflage the genocidal intent of the Nazis. After the war, former Nazis and Nazi sympathizers dismissed the overwhelming proof of the Holocaust. Prisoners awake for roll call. They must stand at attention and are counted. Even the smallest infractions could cause immediate death. Prisoners march to work, where they endure 11 hours of grueling slave labor.
After evening roll call, prisoners slept on overcrowded, lice-ridden wooden bunks.
Thousands of Auschwitz victims blindly proceeded to their deaths. Families stood, gathered, expecting announcements, but were led to their gas chambers where they would soon be suffocated.
The killing tactic locked the prisoners inside the tank, where carbon monoxide and cyclone acid was released, suffocating all instantly.
Nazi camp guards watched the executions through small peepholes. A gas chamber door closes. Thousands of lives
Are taken instantly.
Victims were clothed in filthy rags. There is virtually no hygiene, which caused epidemics and disease. SS men, or masters of death, used whips and sticks on those who did not keep up with the day's laborious tasks.
Prisoners were routinely beaten. Usually these beatings were caused by minor infractions or nothing at all. Serious offenses were punished more severely. The offenders would be punished by either public floggings or public hangings.
Although concentration camps were not successful in the eyes of their victims, Adolf Hitler's mission had nearly been completed, the attempt to wipe out the inferior races. Hitler had failed in his pursuit to abolish all people marked as inferior. He failed as a perfect ruler. He has become the epitome of a tyrant, responsible for one of the most universally known tragedies. He failed to purify the world of its imperfections and failed to exterminate the worldwide religion of Judaism, a religion with over 18 million followers today. Although consequences of the Holocaust, and particularly Auschwitz, may seem obvious, we discover that even some of the minor historical pieces were consequential in ways we may never fully understand.
In April 1975, Cambodia, a southeastern country in Asia, endured Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge rebel group seize in power. Over half of the population of Cambodia was murdered throughout the years of 1975 to 1979. This was the time that the United States evacuated their army troops after a war in Cambodia, making an opportunity for Pol Pot's Year Zero plan in an aim to eliminate the modern world. The rebel group was strong enough to take over the capital, and the Khmer Rouge evacuated Phnom Penh, forcing the communities into the countryside, believing that cities and innovation was evil, and they wanted a society to be purely agricultural. The victims of the genocide were intellectuals, artists, and monks who were perpetrated, then mass murdered, then thrown away into killing fields. He forced the rest of the population into large labor camps with inadequate resources to survive. The most horrific events occurred in the old suburban high school, which was transformed into torture chambers for all suspected enemies. They tortured until a confession could be made about what crime they were charged with. These confessions and photographs would be sent to the high-ranking officials in the Khmer Rouge as a confirmation that the traitors were eliminated. Those that were waiting for their time to come had to endure many horrible things. Their legs were shackled into iron bars placed around the room. Throughout the 1980s, efforts that were made by outside countries to demolish the Khmer Rouge and revive Cambodian society. Finally, in 1991, Cambodia accomplished a peace treaty to enforce ceasefire, and eventually Sihanouk was reclaimed king 2 years later. In the aftermath of what happened, Cambodia laid in ruins. The economy failed since all the engineers, technicians, and plants were killed off. An advanced and organized government clearly exists, and lands that were once places of terror have now been made into memorials dedicated to the many Cambodians who have been murdered. Although the psychological scars were caused by the traumatic genocide that will never cease, the greater sense of nationalism has been created, and the population that is made up of mostly people who haven't experienced genocide has accomplished a great recovery. The failure of the developed world to take action against the Cambodian genocide is significant. The active support of some players of the international stage for the Khmer Rouge is inexcusable. Foreign intelligence agencies, especially the CIA, were involved in supporting Lon Nol's regime and would therefore have knowledge of the Khmer Rouge's murderous methods even before 1975. It was not in the interests of the United States to do anything to solve the problem. The secretive mass bombings by the US Air Force had a significant role in the genocide because the Khmer Rouge wouldn't have had so many recruits to take power if it wasn't for the anger of the American bombs. The US, UK, China, and Thailand helped to rebuild the Khmer Rouge, providing humanitarian, military aid to rebels in areas along the Thai border, enabling them to continue fighting, thus prolonging the suffering of Cambodians in the region. Margaret Thatcher, the British government, sent over highly trained Special Air Service commandos into Cambodia to train the Khmer Rouge on how to use British-supplied landmines, booby traps, and time-delayed devices, while completely denying that such assistance that was given in the first place. However, in June of 1991, the British government was forced to admit training the Khmer Rouge forces. Had the US, UK, and Thailand not supported Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge during and after the group's period in power, the deaths of many thousands of Cambodians would not have occurred.